Hi, this lecture is Timeline. I'm basically going to take you through 1900 and move you into the next century. I'm going to go over some key images, and this is a good overview, a good intro to art. Picasso. Since Picasso was particularly active in 1900, I thought that might be a really good place for us to start. By 1900, he has started moving into Paris, and he's making connections with other people. And he is really a remarkable artist early on. He was a child prodigy. And so by the time he gets to Paris, he's really producing some lovely work. A lot of people don't realize that his early work was very representational. In other words, it looked like exactly what it is. It's not cubist, it's not blue period, it's very representational, very academic art. Born in Malaga, Spain, child prodigy, and this is First Communion, and it is an image of his sister. His father painted as well. His father was an educator, and the story goes that Picasso's father recognized his talent early and gave him his palette. I've also read that he gave him his paintbrushes. No one can doubt his early talent, but the fact of the matter is most art teachers won't say, "Oh, I'm no longer painting anymore because my son can paint." I just think that that's one of the mythologies that are related to Picasso. And there are a lot of mythologies related to Picasso. He could tell a lot of stories. And sometimes he may have exaggerated things, but it's kind of hard to tell. There are an incredible number of quotes of Picasso, and when you're doing research on them, you really have to try to glean, okay, do you think that's really true? And even so, he has a fascinating biography. So this is when he hits Paris is 1900. He's poor. He is very poor. He is not doing well. And he is struggling. He's a struggling artist. He's the iconic struggling artist. And so this is an example of a fin de siècle artwork, which means turn of the century. It's one of the vocabulary words that we were talking about. And so recent cleaning actually revealed a dog in the foreground, which I like because I'm kind of dog crazy. This is in the Montmartre part of Paris. Yes, it sounds like Montmartre, even though it has all those letters in it. And part of Montmartre is the Moulin Rouge, the Red Windmill. And so this is a dance at the La Galette. Galette was a kind of a pancake, so it's kind of a pancake house. It was a pastry of sorts, and it was something that was served in this area of Paris. And Renoir, of course, also had a painting that was Dance at the Moulin de la Galette. So it's kind of moody. It's not really happy, dark palette. So it kind of fits along with Henri Toulouse-Lautrec's kind of moody turn of the century works as well, because there was two responses to the fin de siècle work. Some of them were moody and kind of dark, and some of them were much more lighter and bright, like Renoir and like Gustav Klimt, The Kiss. Those sorts of imagery were, again, much more consciously happy compared to others. This is Pierre-Auguste Renoir's famous Luncheon of the Boating Party, and this has a detail of Aileen. She's the one that's holding the dog. And Aileen, he ultimately marries. His child was a number of years old before they got married, so that was rather shocking for that time period. But Aileen, he was married to for a very long time. And even though he was much older than her, she ended up dying in her 50s, unfortunately. And he was really upset about it. Leaning on the rail is the owner of the restaurant and also his sister as well. In the background, you have a mayor, and you also have a group of people that he was acquainted with. In the foreground, you have Gustave Caillebotte. He's the one in the yellow hat. Gustave Caillebotte often was the one that was picking up the tab when they were at a restaurant situation like this. Now, it's called Luncheon of the Boating Party. It is not on a boat. It is a restaurant on the water. Kind of think Dana Point or something like that. And so this is a restaurant you can actually still go to. It's apparently not very good. Just go there and have a drink. But it also has Caillebotte, and it has a young woman who's an actress sitting there gazing at Caillebotte, like, you know, the very cute guy, and he has a lot of money. And then there is a man above him that you might mistake for a waiter. He has the white coat with the black tie. He's not. He is actually a writer. And there's a woman that's face is covering, glasses covering her face, and she's also an actress. What you are seeing, you're starting to see the mixing of the upper and the lower classes. So this was novel. This was something that was happening in the Montmartre region. It also invites the viewer in. There is a place at the table for you. So you're essentially invited to sit down and join them. And that's kind of appealing. It's essentially Renoir's place is what it is, because it's right next to Hélène. But he, of course, is painting. And it is said that he painted his friends and his acquaintances at different times. Not all of them were in the exact spot at the exact time. But he, again, basically went through the different parts of the painting and populated it like this. But it's a very famous work, and it is by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. So this is a galette. So if you wondered, this is indeed a galette, a Parisian cake or pastry, a flat round bread. And so this is indeed what it is referring to. Now, he also did a smaller version of La Moulin de la Galette, 1876. They argue about which one came first. Most likely, I think this was probably a study for the larger work, or he could have found larger work successful and wanted to make a copy. Both scenarios are certainly possible. And here we have an image of this dappled sunlight. It's kind of a feature of Renoir, is this kind of dappled sunlight as the sun is coming through the trees and is casting these little dots of color. And again, he did produce more than one of these, and the other particular one is much more famous. Some of the girls in the middle of this particular portrait were actually young women that he often used as models. One of them, in fact, was sometimes more often found in the bar. And so he'd occasionally have to pull her out of the bar to come and have her sit for him. And unfortunately, she didn't live to be very old. And actually, it's believed that he even paid for her funeral because she did not have a lot of money as well. So this is the famous work of Renoir. Or at least one of them. And then this is Pablo Picasso. At 19, he was in Paris with his friend Casagemas. Casagemas shot himself over a girlfriend over a breakup. And it affected Picasso profoundly. And in any case, it's called the blue period. And he said it was blue because he was unhappy. And some say it was blue because he had a lot of blue paint. I don't think so. There are quotes that say that he was blue because he was very, very unhappy. And it does seem to pervade a lot of his work. So a blue period is followed by the rose period, which is, some call it the Bohemian period. More people call it the rose period, though. And so this is also turn of the century. And he painted his despondency about the death of his friend Casagemas. And he actually produced a few of these images of Casagemas. Now, the first particular image, I think, is one of the most interesting of the blue period. And the reason for that is it's such an interesting painting. Here this young man is in his early 20s, and he's just lost his friend, and he's painting the funeral of his friend. And there's all these people wailing in the foreground. That's in the front part of the painting. And in the middle ground of the painting, you see a couple of women kind of leaning into each other, crying. You see this maternal woman chasing away children, because children will not come to Chrysegamus because he's died. And then you also see these young women in stockings that are nude, and one of them's jumping on a horse. And it looks like kind of heaven, but it's kind of the heaven that a 20-year-old would imagine. In other words, it's kind of Victoria's Secret models in the sky there. There's no cute little pooty little fat angels. Oh no, this is a very different heaven. And so I've always thought it's a unique work, and it's called Burial of Chrysegamus. But it is interesting. And then you also have the tomb there where he's going to be laid to rest as well. And then we have these images of the death of Chrysegamus. Again, these are all around the turn of the century here. One of them is very blue. This one is more warm colors, and if you look at that light, it looks an awful lot like a certain artist that a lot of you are going to be familiar with. If you look at the brush strokes that are very deep and they're very loose, they certainly look kind of impressionist, but they're too dark to be impressionist. No, they look more post-impressionist. Indeed, they look a lot like the brushwork of Vincent van Gogh. Do I think that he was informed by Vincent van Gogh's work? I do, actually. Again, you can see that kind of a light. You can see that kind of brushwork. Even, in fact, in one of his other paintings, you can actually see some of the chandeliers that look very similar to this particular candle. And so this is a self-portrait of Vincent van Gogh. And again, he's a post-impressionist, and he is before this period of 1900. So again, just kind of giving you a timeline here. I don't tend to test on a lot of dates. It's very, very rare that I would test on a date, and I would even probably say to you, oh, you should probably know this date. Sometimes I want students to understand the dates for Impressionism, for instance, which Impressionism pretty much starts late 1860s, early 1870s. Notably, it begins with a work by Claude Monet. And so French Impressionism goes into the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. By 1890s, a lot of French Impressionists are becoming wealthy, but they hadn't been in the beginning. And then in the early part of the 1900s, Impressionism becomes more popular in the United States, and American Impressionism starts going as well. So there's vestiges of Impressionism well into the 1900s. So here we have the Chrysegamus portrait, and then we also have another work by Vincent van Gogh, who is considered post-impressionist. He's also considered an expressionist artist. He paints his expressions. He paints his moods. And so here we also see this is a night cafe, and it doesn't look like a happy cafe. You have the vantage point is tilted up. These diagonals give you a sense of discomfort. He said that the colors red and green were colors of discomfort for him. On the other hand, yellows and blues were colors that he liked a lot. Now, his early work is largely browns, but the works that we are so beloved are largely blues and golds and yellows. So, Burial of Chrysegamus, again, it's pretty ambiguous, strange even, but I think it's the way a young man conceives heaven. It's the way a young man thinks it might be for his friend who he's lost. And so I like this quote. Fluffy angels do not wait for him in heaven. There are earthly delights, such as prostitutes on the clouds that used to be holy, clad in stockings, because they do look like they belong in a scene in a Henri Toulouse-Lautrec painting. Picasso also shows some El Greco influence on this. El Greco was a Spanish artist, and Picasso was a Spanish artist as well. But he was a Spanish artist who was painting in France. The Wailing Angels definitely resemble some of Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings. And these are from the 1890s, and they would have been around the Montmartre area of Paris. They would have been something that Picasso saw as well. And so definitely I think you can see those inspirations. And this also has a picture of some prostitutes. Their dresses are being held open, and they're up, and they are holding their dresses up for a medical inspection. And believe it or not, the police officers would generally do these medical inspections. Sometimes they'd have a doctor with them, but yeah, I'm sure there was nothing weird about that. But yes, it was, they would actually try to see if they could see imagery or a sense of disease about the women. So I don't try to overthink it too much. But yes, it's disturbing, and it's disturbing image. But post-impressionism is not nearly as happy as impressionism. You have a lot of disquiet because of the turn of the century. You have prostitution is a problem. It's said that around 10% of the population were prostitutes around the latter part of the 1800s. And so certainly disease was rampant as well. So here again are those little fluffy Raphael angels. This is a detail from a Raphael painting. And again, these are a little bit more like Victoria's Secret angels in Picasso's heaven. La Vie. This is an example of his blue period, his sad period, and it's also included his friend Casagemus. And here you see Casagemus' girlfriend there as well. And it looks like it's in their studio. Now keep in mind that Picasso and Casagemus shared a studio. And these are probably Picasso's drawing in the background, more than likely. Picasso tends to be pretty much about Picasso most of the time. And here we have La Vie, which means basically that's life. And La Vie, she's kind of holding this infant away from him. So this is something that's being taken away. So loss of hopes, loss of dreams. For a Spanish male, the loss of his line would have been quite devastating. So it's something that he's painting. A sense of isolation, sense of despair. It's blue, it's sad. And so the sketches are believed to represent sensual love. And again, all of these things that have been taken away. So again, there's this heavy sense of sadness, and there's also this heavy sense of poverty as well. So Man with Guitar, 1911, Still Life and Metronome, 1909. So Picasso and Braque, Analytical Cubism. This was the first phase of Cubism around 1907, 1912, Analytical Cubist. They reduced natural forms to basic geometric parts. And basically they're showing 3D imagery on a 2D surface. So color was subdued in the early part of Cubism. Analytical Cubism is the early part of Cubism, and during Analytical Cubism, the Cubism is gray and taupe and browns, and they're actually producing these works of art right next to each other. They actually were neighbors for a time, and their wives were friends, and they were painting these images that were very similar. In fact, he often laughingly called Georges Braque his wife. Now, the person who gets most of the credit for Cubism is, of course, Picasso. But Georges Braque was certainly just as much a part of the movement as Pablo Picasso. So we really should balance it by giving him credit. So the colors subdued, nearly monochromatic, and these were inspired by the works of art of Paul Cézanne. Paul Cézanne's work often has a sense of the Cubist to it, and so he's a predecessor before Cubism. So this is George Braque, Houses at La Estaque, and this is 1908. So 29 by 24, kind of a normal size painting. And so they developed cubism and papier-collé, which is collage, pasted papers collage. Sometimes in my classes we do collage works, and we do collage works as a way to kind of experience what artists experience making art. So that is often a part of my curriculum as well, and I encourage you to experiment with it. So Cezanne urged artists to study natures in terms of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. And this was in a letter to Emile Bernard. But a lot of these ideas were circulating, and so these ideas of Cubism are rooted in Paul Cézanne. So this is George Braque, Violin and Palette. And again, both of these particular works are early 1900s. And then the first one here is the Portuguese 1911. And these are examples of analytical cubism again. So near monochromatic palette, often instruments. They played instruments, they loved instruments, and so instruments often show up in cubism. So those are another feature. Cubism derived from a comment by Louis Vauxhall. Artists reduce everything, places and figures and houses, to geometric schemes, little cubes. Yeah, essentially. So analytical cubism, taupes, browns, grays, first phase of cubism. And then it moves into synthetic cubism. And so synthetic cubism has some color. So that's one of the main differences of synthetic cubism. This is an example of a synthetic cubist work here. And this is a mandolin and guitar, 1920s, an example of synthetic cubism. So it's a good idea to have an understanding of the difference between analytical cubism and synthetic cubism. Synthetic cubism has color, and collage actually is considered more related to synthetic cubism. So Henri Matisse, he was a contemporary of Pablo Picasso, Madame Matisse, or Woman with a Hat. And so this is a fauve example, fauvism, and French literally means wild animal or wild beast. And they were labeled wild beast because they were producing these bright, bright, vivid colors that were just absolutely wild, and people couldn't quite understand what they were trying to say. Now we look at them and we're not particularly shocked, but they were shocked in this time period when they looked at these bright, bright colored works. They just didn't quite get it. So this is called fauvism. Fauvism is only for a very short time. And again, it means wild beast. And it was only for a few years in the early 1900s, but it's about bright, vivid color. The first work is Madame Matisse in a Hat, or Woman with a Hat. And there's a detail of Woman with a Hat. When we talk about detail, I mean a close-up or part of this work. When you see this work in San Francisco at the MoMA, it's remarkable. It is really incredible. It's really so much better than when you're looking at it in a picture. It's not quite the same. So both of these images are Madame Matisse. She got kind of used to being shown like this. I don't know that she was always delighted, and sometimes she was in fact mortified when she would be painted like this. But I think she kind of learned to go with it. And so Henri Matisse, Green Stripe, or Madame Matisse, 1905. So these are both fauve examples. He came back to this idea of bright, vivid color time and time again. I particularly love A Woman in Purple Coat. This is 1937. So it's not really part of the fauve movement, but it's certainly reflecting back to it to a certain degree. And I totally loved that purple coat, and I would totally wear it, but very cool. Henri Matisse, Open Window. And so this is 1905. He did a lot of these open windows. They show up over and over again in his works. The only reason you might not be familiar with it is because it's from a private collection. More often when something is in a public collection, people become more conscious of it. But this is, as an art historian, I'm very conscious of this, but it might be one that you have not seen. But it is an open window Collier and Matisse open window Nice, 1918. And the Mediterranean, the light, he was just fascinated with the light. He was fascinated with travel, and he liked exotic locations, and they're really, his work is really quite gorgeous. Matisse's Icarus, and Matisse's Icarus has been a work that has been appropriated over and over and over again. So Icarus plate of 7 from the illustrated book Jazz, and then you have Marc Chagall's Fall of Icarus. But this idea of taking an artist imagery and again doing having a bit of an ode to it, we see that in this stamp as well. And so this center one is again from the illustrated book Jazz, 1947, and then the first image is again, it was stamps, not only, I don't know how many years ago, but not very long ago, at the very most 10 years ago. And then Marc Chagall's Fall of Icarus, 1948. So artists are often informed by each other's work. Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, 1889, painted at Saint Remy, located at MoMA, New York. And this is an example of expressionism and post-impressionism. It's very expressionistic. You can see a sense of the swirling emotions of the artist. I've heard people say that it just shows his despair. I don't really think that's true. The reason for that is we have some written documents where he talks about that cypress tree and about how happy cypress trees made him and that he loves cypress trees. So I don't think you can quite give it that reading. In the center of it, it's predominantly a church. The church was very, very important to Vincent van Gogh and his family. He came from a deeply religious family. And I don't think that sort of spirituality easily leaves you. So yes, it does show the turbulence of his emotions, but I think he's also looking at this gorgeous night view. Now, there's some thought that all this bright yellow sparking was actually from some of the medications that he was on. So is it possible? Certainly. So again, there's a lot of different theories about Starry Night, and if you Google it, you can come up with 10 more. Post-impressionist, expressionist, and again, it's about the artist's inner experience, and so it's very, very active and expressionistic. Some of you may have seen those immersive experiences. This is an example. Just a few seconds of those immersive experiences. They're pretty incredible. They're fun. And then here is, of course, just a detail of it. So you can see the thick impasto, the thick application of paint. Most likely he's also using a palette knife to put on some of this paint. Swirling, dynamic, lots of paint being used. He had a close relationship with his brother Theo. We would pronounce it as Theo, but in the French they generally pronounce it as Theo, but it's Theo. And indeed, they were very close, and there's so many letters written to him. And he also helped keep Vincent van Gogh in paint, and that had to have been costly. So early palette is largely earth tones, brown in the style of Rembrandt, works like Potato Eaters by Vincent van Gogh. Later palette, largely blues and yellows and golds. A limited palette. This has a limited palette. He certainly painted with other colors, but there are a huge number of works in this palette. Expressionistic again, influenced by the Impressionist, but it's not pale, it's not pastels. This work is a little bit more moody, so we consider it post-Impressionist. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a German expressionist. The German expressionists certainly are culling from some of the experience of Vincent van Gogh, and in Dresden, this group of artists were called Die Brücke. Die Brücke meant the bridge, and the idea was that it was this group of young men that were bridging the traditional with the new and the innovative, and they wanted to basically find their own voice. And this is a portrait of Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and is by the artist Alan Derwin. You will need to know that particular artist. I'm just citing that it's an interesting portrait of him. And then he is perhaps most known for his Berlin street scenes. So Ernst Ludwig Kirchner is perhaps most known for his Berlin street scenes that are very, very angular and sharp, and they show women on the town and prostitutes on the town, and they look very sharp and edgy. And this is Berlin. So these Berlin street scenes, Berlin was becoming an art center. In fact, it still is really. And so Die Brücke, or the bridge, a group of German expressionists based in Dresden and Berlin between 1905 and 1913. Mostly painters, they depicted landscapes, nudes, and carnival performers in strong colors and these broad swaths of color. They also revived the German woodcut tradition, but this was as more of a form of personal expression. And so Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, self-portrait, and you see him here. He looks rather sad and depressed, and he has his drink there, but it's not a happy picture, not at all. So he created a lot of these works in periods of loneliness and insecurity, and you can see that in some of them. They don't look happy particularly. Even though it's supposed to be a Berlin street scene, it just doesn't look quite happy. It still has an edginess to it. So two well-dressed prostitutes stroll the streets, surrounded by glancing men that again look very sharp, literally as like angular. For the Kirchner, the prostitute was a symbol of modern city, glamour, danger, intimacy. Everything was for sale. These intense, jarring colors are also something that's kind of part of his oeuvre, part of his style. And this kind of tilted horizon also destabilizes the scene. When you see strong diagonals in an artwork, often what you're seeing is the artist trying to make you feel a little uncomfortable. So strong diagonals sometimes bring you in and give interest, but more often it creates a sense of instability. Okay, so here we have uh, another example. You have a drawing of one of these Berlin street scenes, but you can see kind of the gesture and the sharp movement to it that shows the energy that he's putting in these works, and that's what I like about this drawing. So elongated figures, blank staring eyes, not really happy, active during World War I and then later World War II. Ultimately, he commits suicide. He did not like the negative response, excuse me, of the degenerate art exhibit under the Hitler regime. And here he was becoming this well-known artist, and his work was being despised, and he didn't handle it well. It was an emotional man, and he was an artist, and it devastated him. Self-portrait as a soldier. Here he shows his self-portrait. You have in the background you have a portrait of a young woman. It appears to be like a painting, perhaps. Sometimes some have said it's a prostitute. Um, but he shows himself with his hand cut off. And he shows himself basically being destroyed. And what would destroy an artist more than having his hand removed? And so his hand is removed. He feels destroyed, and so it shows this soldier with his hand cut off is being destroyed. And so there is this conflict of identity, the artist, the soldier, and I think it's one of the more haunting images that was produced by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who was a good-looking man. We have a few pictures of him. Vasily Kandinsky, father of abstract art, example of Russian expressionism. And so this is composition 7. And he's believed to be a synesthetic. What is a synesthetic? A synesthetic is a person who basically feels and sees color. What I mean by feels and sees color, it's said that when he would listen to music, he would see streaming color. And so in a sense, he's using art to express what he sees. In a very real way, Yayoi Kusama does the same. She's the woman that sees dots. She actually has a mental illness where she has seen dots and she's had hallucinations since she was a child, and she paints that world. She paints those dots. In a similar way, this synesthetic would listen to music and see streaming lights, and so he's often painting those images. And so a little bit more on Vasily Kandinsky. I've talked about him before. So he was Russian, and he was a teacher. He was an educator. He also had a fairly long relationship with an artist named Gabriele Munter, and she was really part of his circle. And for a long time, all mention of her just kind of dropped. And in recent years, there's been more interest in Gabriele Munter. Franz Marc, also a German expressionist. He's one that was interested in painting animals, and usually animals in bright, vivid colors. He was part of the Blue Rider group. He used colors symbolically. Blue is spiritual, masculine. Yellow is more feminine. Red is related to the earth. Marc was not at all crazy with humankind and felt animals were much more in tune with life and nature. He was very disillusioned with the war, and he was very influenced by Matisse. He loved horses especially. So this is Franz Marc, Horse in the Landscape. And this is his red horses or grazing horses. So perhaps most famous for this particular image, and this is Blue Horses. He was also part of the Der Blaue Reiter or Blue Rider group. The Blue Rider group also included Vasily Kandinsky as well. And so he's an expressionist artist. He's painting in a very, very expressionistic way as well. So unfortunately, he died in World War I, so he didn't fully develop as an artist. We don't know exactly what he would have done had he lived a little bit longer. But he's very well known as a German expressionist for these images of horses, red cows, yellow cows. Hitler spoke up with great disdain of his work because he thought his pictures were ridiculous, which is all the more reason to love them. So Futurism, a self-portrait of Umberto Bocciano. Bocciani is a sculptor. He also was a printmaker, and he did other things as well, but he's most known as a sculptor. And this is unique forms of continuity in space. Honestly, that's probably the only work I would make you responsible for as far as related to Umberto Bocciani. But he's also a futurist artist. It was a very brief moment in time where these Italian artists were painting and working in sculpture in a very futuristic way. And this is another example of development of a bottle in space, 1913. Nude Descending a Staircase. Some of you know him as the artist that produced, of course, the ready-made fountain. But he also produced Nude Descending a Staircase, and he did that earlier. And this Nude Descending a Staircase was ridiculed, and he kind of decided, I'm not going to do this anymore. And so he did sculpture and he did other things. And the second one is an example of a portrait of Marcel Duchamp. We don't pronounce the P. And he is basically going down the stairs, and it's kind of showing how Nude Descending a Staircase might have worked. And this was produced by Man Ray. So his friend Man Ray did that picture of Marcel Duchamp basically going down the staircase. And then you can also compare it to Bocciani, which, of course, Bocciani's work has that same amount of movement. But Nude Descending a Staircase was not received well. People ridiculed it a great deal. President Teddy Roosevelt said that it looked like an explosion in a shingle factory, and he compared it to a Navajo blanket, and people said all kinds of rude things about it. So it was not received well. Umberto Bocciani, Synthesis of Human Dynamicism. And so here is, again, very similar to his most famous work, which is, of course, this particular sculpture. So this is Futurism defined, was from Filippo Marinetti, who called for a new art, a futuristic art. So this was around 1910. Aim was to express the energetic, dynamic, violent quality of modern life, embodied in the motion and force of modern machinery. And so very industrialized, aggressive action, a feverish insomnia, the racers stride, punch, and slap. And it tended to be a little bit politicized, and so there was some negativity related to that. So Unique Forms of Continuity in Space is his notable work, and it's shown right there. Dadaism, again, here's Marcel Duchamp. And so Marcel Duchamp, this of course is a ready-made, and he used the pseudonym R. Mutt, 1917. And the group that he's associated with is Dadaism. So it's a non-art or anti-art movement originated in Zurich, childlike, nonsensical, kind of da 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 ba 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 ba, like a child might make. noise. And so considered one of the most influential artists of all time, even today, innovative. And this is an example of a ready-made. It's an object that says, this is art because I say it's art. And he names it and he places it and he displays it. And yeah, it's pretty wild. And so it empowers the artist. And he was original. And that's what the ode is about. So it's been appropriated a great deal. Remember, to appropriate something, you have to change it a bit. So here, Sherry Levine changed it quite a bit by making it gold. And she's also remarking on the fact that she's a female artist and she is producing a ready-made. And then there's Not Jusham by Mike Bidlow, and this particular work is done of marble. But again, it's not functional. It's turned on the wrong way. The urinal is twisted on, basically not useful. And so in any case, these are appropriations. So these are appropriations related to Marcel Duchamp's work. Now, I made an appropriation of Marcel Duchamp's work, and I wonder if I ever took a picture of it. I don't think I did. I'll have to appropriate it again. But I actually took a toddler potty chair, and I signed it, and I dated it, and I took it to class and said, why is this not art? And basically, it's not art because I'm not the originator of that idea. Marcel Duchamp gets all the credit. So my little potty chair, even though it's an appropriation, and I've changed it a great deal because it's a child's potty chair, and I've signed it and titled it and made it my own, doesn't seem to get the same excitement. And of course, Fountain, there are more than one official examples of it. The original was supposedly lost, but he was still alive, so he sanctioned a specific number of these works that are fountains. And again, I'm sure they sell for millions, but we don't get to do that. So many appropriations since, and you can see here, it is pretty funny. One of those things a lot of people just do not get is Marcel Duchamp. LHOOQ. Here, Marcel Duchamp actually took basically an image of Mona Lisa and he appropriated it. He changed it. He made it his own. He gave her a little mustache and a little beard, and he wrote LHOOQ, which basically means, if you're a French speaker, and I'm not, if you say LHOOQ a certain way, it sounds like she has a hot ass. So it's ironic because, first of all, she's sitting and we don't get to see her ass. But he also was, they love sexual punning, they love little jokes. So this is very Dada. And so this is a Mona Lisa that's been appropriated by Marcel Duchamp, LHOOQ. So color reproduction, heightened with pencil, white gouache. Funnily enough, a poster of this was in one of my classrooms at Fullerton College, the junior college, where I taught for a number of years as well. And one of the students came and told me that somebody had drawn a mustache on Mona Lisa and I needed to take it down. And I had to explain to him that, no, that's the artwork. So yeah, kind of a fun story. So yes, appropriation. He also produced Bride Stripped Bare of Her Bachelor's Even, or Large Glass. And so they often use these odd sexual allusions, weird little puns, mechanics of sex, and supposedly this particular work is that. You have these, on the very bottom panel, you have a group of figures that are kind of going around a more feminine figure with the skirt. And those are called the bachelors, and she is again, in this little skirt in the center. And it's as if the suitors are trying to capture her attention. It has all this glass and these little metal parts and these little constructions, and no one really understood what he was doing. And he fussed with this for a long time. And finally, someone said, "When is this going to be done?" And what happened was, shortly, it became broken. And he said, "It's done." So I think it's kind of as if to maybe mirror virginity, the loss of virginity, something being broken, the hymen being broken. At least I'm trying to explain Marcel Duchamp, which is really funny because you can't really explain Marcel Duchamp, but he's fascinating. One of his very, very last works is even more fascinating. And I'll try to remember to put that in the module as well. This is Salvador Dali. Everyone loves Salvador Dali. If you teach an intro to art class, you kind of have to cover Salvador Dali. At least I think you do. It's kind of the rules. So Salvador Dali, of course, is known as a surrealist. And he was kind of known to be really kind of crazy in a really fun way. And you just never really knew what he was going to do. He liked to be unpredictable. He was really an incredible marketer because everyone wanted to know what he was going to do next. And so he became very, very wealthy. So this is Accommodation of Desire. It's by Salvador Dali. Oil and cut and pasted printed paper on cardboard. It embraces something psychological, which we call Jungian theory. Carl Jung, who was associated with Sigmund Freud. And Freudian imagery, the yonic is soft and round and female, breast-like, really. And then sometimes in Jungian psychology, you'll also have the phallic, which of course is more male and sharp and rounded and cucumbers, that kind of thing. So he's taken this idea of the feminine with this particular work. And it's called, again, Accommodation of Desire. You can be making sense of the titles. Sometimes they just do not match what he is painting. Very, very true with René Magritte as well. And this is trompe-l'oeil, which means fools the eye. He makes it hyper realistic. Some of the features of Salvador Dali is there's sometimes eggs or egg-like features. This has kind of that. There's often insects, grasshoppers in particular, ants. This one has ants. And it also has a sense of dream imagery. So he was very much interested in analysis of his dreams. And one of the features also of Salvador Dali is when you see that kind of blue palette with maybe gold, like blues and golds and browns, kind of a wasteland landscape. This has vestiges of that. You just have a sliver of the blue at the top. And some of that is inspired by his Catalan upbringing, his Spanish upbringing. And the Catalan coast was something that was appealing to him, and that's something that shows up in a number of his works. Magritte's Attempting the Impossible. Again, the titles do not generally match what he is painting. There is some memorization, I have to say, in art history. But René Magritte, more often I ask you to identify the artist's work. And once you've seen a number of René Magritte's work, his work is certainly recognizable. One of the features of Magritte's that you often see is clouds. He had a thing for clouds. He's a surrealist. He was a friend of Salvador Dali. I can't say they were particularly close friends, but they did know each other. He feasted on the unconscious. He loved spontaneity and chance. Psychology, Freudian interpretation of dreams enthralled the surrealist. Carl Jung, the analysis of yonic and phallic. There's often a heightened sexuality. I mean, this work is 1928, so this for 1928 was really quite provocative. Here he's painted Georgette. Georgette was his wife. And you see a photograph of the original, in fact. And oddly enough, he painted in dress shirts and usually, sometimes even in an Italian suit. So he would often be painting in his suit at the dining room table. He wasn't one to sit in a studio. I think he had a close relationship with his wife, and he wanted to be with her, I think. One of the problems with an artist in the studio is you can be kind of closeted up all by yourself. And as an artist myself, often when my kids were little, I would bring my easel downstairs and I put it at the dining room table, kind of for similar reasons, is just to be part of things. They never had any children, but they, by all accounts, they had a close relationship, and this is his wife, Georgette. So the idea of the id, the ego, and the superego fascinated them, which is in psychology, dream imagery, and again, they had rather radical ideas. So back to Salvador Dali, Accommodations of Desire is in the top corner. And then we also have a detail of the 1921 painting of Dali's grandmother sewing. And then we also have the bright yellow, I don't know what you would even call it, silhouette really, is called the Great Masturbator. And if you kind of turn your head sideways and you look at the yellow form, you can see a nose, and you can see eyelashes, and you can see an eyebrow, and it kind of looks like a silhouette of Salvador Dali. And the silhouette shows up in more than one of his works. And yes, you also see a beautiful woman who is Gala, Gala. Gala was his wife. And she was originally the wife of a friend, but she became his wife. Enough said. And here we have the grasshopper. If you look close, there's an egg. You also have the wasteland of the blues and the golds in the background. And then you have a very sexualized image, and that's again classic Salvador Dali, and that's called The Great Masturbator, 1929. I think his best works are around 1929 and 1930, right in there. So he had a flair for self-drama, self-promotion, hyperactive imagination. He was fascinating, and people loved him. In fact, I'll write a note to slip in a Salvador Dali clip. But Salvador Dali is a fascinating man, really is. So let me move on. So this is very representational. This is early in his career. This is a portrait of his grandmother sewing, and this is at Dali's Theater and Museum in Spain. If you ever get a chance to go to the Tampa area, St. Petersburg, there is a Salvador Dali museum there that is sensational. It is well worth it. So I recommend it highly. This is his iconic work. This is his most famous work, and this is Persistence of Memory. Persistence of Memory doesn't really particularly match this as well. This is little. This is around the size of a sheet of paper. It's around 8 by 16. So maybe just a little bit larger. It's very, very finely painted. It's painted with trompe l'oeil. There's that term again. So that trompe l'oeil, fools the eye style. It has those ants. It has the Catalan coastline behind it. Time is melting away. There's that silhouette again. If you turn your head to the side and you see a nose, and you see his chin, and you see this kind of a silhouette. It appears to be a silhouette of Salvador Dali. In fact, look at the top of the clock, and it forms a distinctive mustache. It's also been described as a sloth-like figure, S-L-O-T-H, a sloth-like figure, like you might find in a zoo, kind of hanging from a tree. And then what he said it was about was he said it was inspired by camembert cheese. Melting cheese was the inspiration for this work. So there's 3 different readings. You have his silhouette, you have a sloth-like creature, and then you also have camembert cheese. But it's a dreamlike imagery. Can you have another interpretation? Absolutely, you can. And so again, you have time melting away, the Catalan-Spanish coastline, and then you have this kind of slab in the background that almost looks like something from a CSI episode. I think that's a little bit of death imagery myself. But again, time is melting away, and some of the things of which he was paranoid about were insects and sexuality. He had a lot of phobias. He was afraid of trains and planes and cars and almost anything, really. And he would say to anybody who would listen that he, had problems with his sexuality, and he was impotent. He liked to get attention. He really, really did. But he's a fascinating artist. So here we see more images of time melting away. These are all by Salvador Dali. So Salvador Dali is here kind of appropriating his own masterpiece, but it's by far his most well-known work. And so again, in The Great Masturbator, again, you see the portrait of this yellow blob thing, and you compare it to the camembert cheese of kind of melting away. And the whole cheese thing was actually at a dinner party. He said they were all basically sitting there chatting, and he was looking at this camembert cheese melting away on the table, and he had inspiration. So he got inspiration everywhere. Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of War. And so this is 1936. Again, I think 1930s is kind of epic Salvador Dali, some of the most incredible artworks. And this was Premonition of War, again, wartime. This is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And there's those colors again, that palette of these golds and browns with the blue in the background. Again, Salvador Dali. Can you make any particular sense of this? No, not really. This is a war machine, and this is dream imagery. So they were very influenced by Giorgio de Chirico's Song of Love, 1914. This was the catalyst for many of the surrealists. This particular work inspired them. The disparate parts of classical art, the classical sculpture, and then you have this rubber glove, and then you have this background of bright blue, and the palette here looks a lot like Salvador Dali, but it is indeed by Giorgio Chirico. And then we also have Disquieting Muses, 1916, 1918. So this is surrealist, kind of before surrealist, but he was definitely the catalyst for a lot of the surrealist images that followed. Painting brings together incongruous, unrelated objects, the head of a classical Greek statue, a rubber glove, a green ball, and a train shrouded in darkness. You can only see the background of that. Silhouetted against a bright blue sky by subverting the logical presence of objects, De Chirico creates metaphysical paintings, what lies behind the physical world. So his world was sometimes described as metaphysical art as well. And this is more on Rene Magritte. So Rene Magritte, again, painted in a suit. And here he has an image of a man in a suit. And they have the bowler hat, the signature bowler hat that is epic. Rene Magritte is those bowling hats. And this is Golconda, a ruined city. And in my mind, I don't call it Golconda, a ruined city. I call it It's Raining Men. But that's not the title. The second one is called Son of Man. Okay, well, there's an apple, an atom, kinda. Again, don't try to make sense of the titles because you can't really. And then the 1962 work is High Society, Surrealism. And again, you see those clouds motif. admittedly, he liked painting clouds. Over and over and over again, vestiges of clouds show up in his work. So here is one of his more famous images, this image of an eye. It's called False Mirror, and False Mirror might look familiar to some of you. And then those gorgeous images of birds. This is also one of the signature images of Rene Magritte. And so here you see him in his signature bowling hat. And again, it's kind of surrealist quality to this photo. And this is him as a much older man. So 1898 to 1967. So Belgian, surrealist, clouds and people with covered or decapitated heads. It may look back to an important childhood event. His mother committed suicide when he was a preteen. So I think most accounts place him at 13 years old. And he basically wakes up to a world where in the middle of the night, his mother got out and drowned herself in a river. And several days later, they found her, and she had her head covered with a nightgown. He did not see that. Most experts agree that he never saw that, but he would have heard about it. And sometimes I think what you hear and the stories you hear, especially when it relates to someone you love and care for, can be just as devastating, maybe more, because you're imagining what happened. He painted at the dining room table in a suit. Bowler hats, suits recur over and over again in his oeuvre. Oeuvre is shown there on the bottom, and that means style. And it's a very distinctive, recognizable style. And then you have these images of inspiration that he did in a painting as well. And so this is called Magritte, the Key to Dreams. And so the egg equals the acacia, the shoe equals the moon, the bowler hat equals the snow, the candle equals the ceiling, the glass equals the storm, and the hammer equals the dessert. Do I think he was trying to tell us anything or give us a certain code to his works? No, I think he was just messing with us. But him and Salvador Dali were both very good at that. Oops. So False Mirror was later taken up by CBS. CBS said it had nothing to do with this. I think they lied. So this was 1928 image False Mirror compared to an early CBS logo with clouds. I definitely think they appropriated it. And then all these images of shrouded women, naked women, women with their heads cut off. Yeah, I think it might be related to his mother. Here's an image of his mother with his brother, Paul. So the other type of surrealist art was more abstract, more biomorphic, organic forms. Juan, it looks like Joan, but it's pronounced Juan Moreau, and the mobiles of Alexander Calder and Jan Arp. Jan Arp, interestingly enough, spelled his first name two different ways. When he would be in Germany, or when he would be in, is it Switzerland? But he would tend to use the H, and when he was in France, he would tend to use the J. Yeah, that's not confusing or anything. But yes, or we could just say ARP. But he was also a sculptor that had a very organic feel to his work. So this particular famous work, and it is a famous work, it is one of those key artworks in art history, is Carnival of Harlequin. Well, where's Harlequin? Oh, I'm not entirely sure. It's very abstract. There's no wrong answers here. It is this idea of carnival. It is this idea of Mardi Gras, perhaps. And it's playful, it's light, it's all these organic shapes. And this is an example from the Spanish artist Miró. Here you can see a little bit larger of an example. So, but again, very, very well-known artwork. Kind of one of those notable works in art history. So when I talk about it having an organic shape or an amoeba-like shape, and then you can also compare it to Jan Arp's work. It almost looks like some of Jan Arp's work has been shown in Miró's work. And so this is the idea of biomorphic surrealism. It's not as dreamlike as, say, René Magritte or certainly Salvador Dali, or certainly some of the other. There were some female surrealists too that are unfortunately not given much credit. So, untitled collage with squares arranged according to the laws of chance, and it's torn in pasted paper and colored paper on a colored ground. Supposedly, to create these pieces of paper fell, and that's how they fell. I don't think so, but that's the story. So I have to tell you the story and what the research says. American regionalism, Grant Wood, American Gothic. I bet most of you thought this was a man and wife. It is not a man and a wife. Supposedly, it depicts a man and his sister. The artist actually used his dentist and his sister. But again, I think it's funny that a lot of us make this assumption that it's a man and wife, and it really isn't. So it's a Great Depression, 1930s and 40s, a return to realism to portray society, landscape. The reason it's called American Gothic is because of that Gothic lancet window. There's a lancet window, L-A-N-C-E-T, a lancet window, a pointed arch window right behind them. And so that lancet window is an American Gothic feature. And so it's been an American Gothic feature that's not on a church, it's on a home. And so this is American regionalism, American Gothic, and it again refers to that architecture. But it also kind of reflects this stern kind of Gothic quality. They look just kind of staid and upright. And anyway, so this is oil on beaver board. He won a $300 prize, and this was instant fame for Grant Wood. So, and I think it's still pretty well known. I think most people know this work, but it also conveys isolation, loneliness, sadness. There's a sense of this couple being very separate. He spotted a little wood farmhouse, Carpenter Gothic. I imagined American Gothic people with their faces stretched out long to go with the American Gothic house. He used his sister and his dentist as models for the farmer and his daughter, dressing them as if they were tintypes from my old family album. But again, I think a lot of people make the assumption it's a man and wife. The highly detailed polished style and the rigid frontality of the two figures were inspired by Flemish Renaissance art, which Wood studied during his travels to Europe between 1920 and 1928. This is from Art Institute of Chicago. This is also by the same artist. This is by Grant Wood, and this is Daughters of the Revolution, oil on masonite, Cincinnati Museum of Art. And it's really kind of different, and this is the same artist. And again, these look like very uptight women. And so these are daughters of the American Revolution who are interested in genealogy and lineage, but they have a very formal quality to them. I mean, and the way she's holding her teacup. And anyway, so he had a real interest in nostalgia, regionalism, American themes. And so this is Daughters of the Revolution by Grant Wood. Piet Mondrian, composition with red, blue, and yellow, abstract expressionism, a Dutch artist, emigrated in 1940s. He relied upon verticals, horizontals, and bold graphics. He liked to use red, yellow, and blue, primary colors. So this was his typical palette. He didn't like to use green or orange. Does it look familiar? As you're looking at this, what does it remind you of? Just look at it for a moment. I'll let you just kind of go. Does it resonate with you at all? It should. The Monopoly board. Piet Mondrian inspired the Monopoly board. So yes, there is a distinctive look that is reflected in the Monopoly board. Dan Flavins to Piet Mondrian, who did not have green. Again, he worked in red, yellow, and blue, primary colors, composition with red, yellow, and blue. Now remember, historically speaking, red, yellow, and blue have been what is called primary colors. Today, especially with computers, we recognize cyan, this brighter blue, magenta, which is more what they show as the intersecting red in this work, and yellow. And under the colors lecture, there is a link talking more about that. But again, historically speaking, red, yellow, blue are in fact the primary colors. But today, cyan, C-Y-A-N, magenta, and yellow are considered primary colors. Neither's really wrong. It's just all part of the history. Portrait of Sidney Janis, art collector with Mondrian painting. And this is by George Segal. One moment, please. Sorry. I have a dog. I will not just start re-recording. Why bother? So here we have a sculptor, plaster figure with Mondrian's composition, 1933, on an easel. And he's known for this very, very distinctive white figures. That is what's recognizable. So when you see an image by George Segal, you're probably going to recognize it right away because they're very distinctive and they're usually these white figures. This is George Segal. Compare it to Edward Hopper's hotel room. There's a sense of isolation in American artist Edward Hopper's hotel room, and then compare it to George Segal's Lady on a Bed, a very common theme. And so the sense of isolation you see with both artists. But he's known for these figures, these white figures. And so here's a number of George Segal's works. And again, they're very distinctive. And they remind me of Edward Hopper's work as well, the sense of isolation and loneliness, but in sculptural form. I think this one's a pretty cool picture as well. And here you see a group of Segal's works just sitting here, and then you see somebody just sitting there enjoying the park bench as well. It's pretty fun. This is George Segal. He also produced something after Henri Matisse. He appropriated the image of Henri Matisse, but gave it his own spin as well. And this is Henri Matisse, The Dance, first version. He produced a second version that's much brighter, and it's also really quite gorgeous. And then this is George Siegel's The Dancers, and this is bronze with a white patina. He also did a number of these images at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco, and you can almost miss it if you're not careful. In front of the Legion of Honor, there's a large fountain, and then to the side, there's this sculpture, and you look over and you see this, and it's haunting, really, and it's George Siegel's The Holocaust. And here you see this figure and then this pile of bodies. It is haunting. It is absolutely haunting. So this is at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco. And then here we see some George Siegel sculptures in the museum. In the background, those panels, those bright panels, are by Ellsworth Kelly. Ellsworth Kelly paints these solid paintings, often solid colors like this, but they're very distinctive, and that's Ellsworth Kelly. But in the foreground is, again, sculptures by George Siegel in the museum. You could also compare it to the Hellenistic Roman copy of a Greek hermaphrodite, and this is 2nd century before Common Era. And so this is sometimes more accurately called a Greek hermaphroditos figure. Now, yes, I know we would call it an intersex figure, but again, this is the one that it's been called for centuries, so I'm giving you both. And it is a unique image because from the back you make the assumption that it is a woman, but it is a they. So as you turn around the corner, you can see the phallus, and you go, oh, okay. And in Greco-Roman history, they liked the surprise of that. These hermaphroditos figures actually recurred. There was a number of them. Unfortunately, in reality, if a hermaphroditos figure was born, an intersex figure was born, which I think is like 1 in 100,000, they weren't as open to letting the child live, which is devastating. And they would leave them on hillsides. It was really quite horrible. And yet, these incredible images of the hermaphroditos were something that they produced over and over again in their sculptures. And so this is during the ancient Greeks. And so this was a Roman copy of a Greek hermaphroditos, 2nd century before Common Era. And what that means is most likely the original was in bronze and it was melted. So sometimes we don't have the original because a lot of Greek artworks were melted because of warfare, because the Greeks were often at war. And so you often see this Roman copy of a Greek original. That's indeed what you're seeing, is the fact that so many of the original bronzes were melted. Willem de Kooning, Abstract Expressionism. Abstract Expressionism, he's grouped with artists like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and certainly Helen Frankenthaler. And this is a Dutch artist, Willem de Kooning, who worked as a New York school in New York, and active thrashing lines, very, very expressive. He actually took a while to produce this work. And there's a primal goddess-like quality to it, but the feminist hated it, hated it, hated it, hated it. And that to a certain degree, the more they hated it, the more attention he got, and he laughed all the way to the bank. So it kind of worked in his favor. A certain amount of notoriety is certainly didn't hurt him. So he did more than one version of these woman figures. And again, they're slashing, they're bold. This one has large breast and is fuller figured, and she has this kind of cheese grater mouth. And so here are some examples of these woman series. Yes, and again, it's very active, it's very gestural, it's very slashing, and that is again something that he was doing. Woman on a Bicycle, by far my favorite Willem de Kooning work, Woman on a Bicycle. I challenge you to look for the bicycle. You can kind of see one wheel, you can kind of see another, but my personal favorite detail is it looks like she's wearing high heels. And not a whole lot of women like to bicycle in high heels. She also has multiple mouths, which is interesting. She's large-breasted. Again, she's kind of the sturdy woman. And then we also have Marilyn Monroe, which doesn't look like any of the pictures I know of Marilyn Monroe. She's been very much reduced, abstracted a great deal. Mark Rothko, this is an example of New York School abstract expressionist, and this is number 5, number 22. This is huge. In one of my images, I don't know if I put it in this lecture, we'll soon see, I actually have a 6-foot plus security guard standing in front of it, just so you can see the size. And so it was date 1950, and it's again very large. And the idea is that the color can immerse the viewer, and the viewer can have individual responses to the color. Some may feel positively to this color, some may feel negatively to this color. I tend to have a more positive feeling towards yellows and oranges. But Dori Ashton, who is the biographer of Mark Rothko, and she would know, says that this is tragic. This is a tragic work. Again, there are different readings in art. This is called a color field. In art history, we call Mark Rothko's works a color field. So again, viewer can interpret their response to the work, to the color. You're immersed in it. And so it was a very original idea, but he didn't handle his success well at all. And he passed away of suicide. Unfortunately, at the height of his power, really. But he was a depressive. Edward Hopper's iconic Nighthawks, 1942. He's an American realist, modernist artist, sharp, clean lines, very spare. His, often I showed you those bedroom rooms with one woman sitting in them. His figures tend to be pretty isolated, pretty lonely, and this has a sense of that as well. And so this is his famous Nighthawks, 1942. So he was originally trained as an illustrator, but between 1901 and 1906 he studied under Robert Henri, as did his wife, Jo. Jo Hopper also was a painter. She also studied under Robert Henri, and yet a lot of people don't hear about her. But she was also an artist, and they had a very tumultuous, very love-hate relationship. It was not a happy marriage. And so here you see an example of Nighthawks, and then you also see an appropriation of Nighthawks. The bottom corner is an appropriation of it, and again, it's a pretty famous appropriation of it. It's by Gottfried Hellwine, and it's called Boulevard of Broken Dreams. and in Boulevard of Broken Dreams that is based on Nighthawks. You have James Dean at the counter, you have Humphrey Bogart in the background, you have Marilyn Monroe next to Humphrey Bogart, and you have Elvis serving them at the counter, which I think is kind of interesting. But again, he's the one at the counter. I think this is a fun print to actually have it in my family room. I like it. Here you can see they're pretty close, but it's an appropriation. Now, interestingly enough, this appropriation is pretty famous too. So it's very popular. Georgia O'Keeffe, one of my favorite artists. I love her bold, large, giant flowers that she paints and her remarkable desert scenes. Very colorful. Born in 1887, she lived to be almost 100 years old, well into her late 90s. She was born near Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. She also was a teacher. She taught art as well. Maybe one of the reasons I like her. She received her training at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Art Students League of New York, the University of Virginia, and the Columbia University's Teacher College. So she's very well educated. And a fun fact, she was one of the people that inspired Yayoi Kusama to come to the United States. Yayoi Kusama wrote her, and Georgia O'Keeffe wrote her back and said, you need to come to the United States. Go to New York. And she did. Georgia O'Keeffe didn't really keep up a relationship with her, but I think it's pretty cool that she took the time to write her. So she became an art teacher and taught in various elementary schools, high schools, but she's perhaps most known for her incredible paintings. She's known for these large-scale flowers, largely. And she said the reason she produced these large-scale flowers was so people would really, really look at them. She wanted people to see these gorgeous details. And it's the idea of taking it and making you look at this huge flower. It's pretty innovative and pretty cool, and this is called Oriental Poppies. She was inspired by someone called Arthur Dove. This is Sunrise 1, 1936, and honestly, if I didn't have the Arthur Dove name right under that, I might look at that and go, oh, it looks a little bit like a Georgia O'Keeffe, but it's not. And so Dove is considered one of America's first abstract painters, an early abstract painter. And he uses these forms to experiment with the physical world. And so this was very much inspired. This very much inspired her. Now, the two artists eventually introduced by the photography and gallery owner Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz became her husband as well. Now, Alfred Stieglitz, when they met, was already married, but ultimately that was taken care of, and then they ultimately did end up being married. They also had a fairly tumultuous relationship. Sometimes he lived in New York and she lived in New Mexico, and that seemed to work pretty well because he wasn't known to be true to one woman. And indeed, ultimately, she wasn't known to be particularly true to him either. So, but initially, definitely was. Lake George, 1922. This is also by Georgia O'Keeffe. And this has, you can see the Fauvism and modernism experience very much is informing her work here. The reflection on the water in Lake George. Lake George is where she went with her husband to vacation. He had a family home there, and so they would go to Lake George, and so a number of her works reflect it. Jimson Weed, one of her more famous works, 1930s. I think the San Diego Museum of Art owns one of them, so they're really, really quite lovely. They're gorgeous works. And so, Georgia O'Keeffe, modernist, certainly her work has a very distinctive style, all her own. She experimented with flowers and skyscrapers and desert scenes and lots of sunsets, and also Southwest landscapes. From the Plains, Georgia O'Keeffe, 1954. Okay, so she's known for her abstractions. She's known for these giant flowers. She's also associated with something called precisionism. You see how tight and sharp those lines are. They're very, very precise, precisionism. Stieglitz was a photographer and, in fact, documented his relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe pretty well. And there's some gorgeous portraits of Georgia O'Keeffe, some nudes that are absolutely incredible. And this is from the back window and looking northwest from the Shelton. Looking northwest from the Shelton is considered one of his notable works. The sharp chiaroscuro, the sharp light-dark contrast. And again, you see this emerging New York. And so here we have a portrait of them, Alfred Stieglitz and George O'Keeffe. She wasn't a gorgeous woman, but she was a handsome woman, I would say. Roy Lichtenstein, Wham! I press the fire control and ahead of me rockets blaze through the sky. Wham! Bright, brilliant colors, certainly see comic strip inspiration here. He is associated with pop art. Remember, pop art is popular art. Pop art, other pop artists are artists like Andy Warhol, and certainly neo-pop artists like Yayoi Kusama, although Yayoi Kusama was also active with the pop artist as well. She's led a long, long life. So this is a portrait of Roy Lichtenstein, and he's no longer with us. And then in the background, you see the large painting. But again, this aspect of comic strips, when I was talking about the terms associated with Lichtenstein, Ben Day dots was something that was part of that. Ben Day dots are, again, a term associated with these little comic strip dots. And so here we have these kind of archetypal images. Why, Brad Darling, this painting is a masterpiece. My, soon you'll have all of New York clamoring for your work. And so this is kind of ironic because ultimately people were clamoring for Roy Lichtenstein's work. So there is often a narrative, a story, kind of a soap opera, and you want more. You want to know what the situation is. You want to know what it's about. And people are fascinated by it. Roy Lichtenstein in the Car, 1963. He looks really, really kind of pissed at her. You really wonder what just was said. And so this is pop art, popular art, again, 1960s. Richard Diebenkorn, and he is an abstract artist. And Diebenkorn, modernist, born Portland, Oregon, Berkeley educated, indifferent to trends, interested in studying art at an early age. He went to Stanford, and he was in the Marines in the 1940s. He went to UC Berkeley and California School of Fine Arts, and he was very prolific. He produced a number of works. This is an artist in his studio, and here he's shown with 1950 work that is no longer extant, which means it no longer exists, which means it was either destroyed or was in a fire or something happened to it. So Diebenkorn Basics, very well educated, California College of Arts and Crafts, San Francisco Art Institute, University of California at Los Angeles, UCLA. Abstract artist mostly, some figurative work, really more known as an abstract artist. Tends to have solitary individuals. Transparent layers are typical, so he doesn't always fill it in and make it opaque. So this is Untitled, 1946, oil on canvas. Richard Diebenkorn Foundation. This is inspired by the seascape near his Berkeley home, so Berkeley, California. And this kind of exemplifies his ability to represent time, space, and light with shifting hues, bold lines, and opaque, which opaque means not see-through, geometric shapes. So this is Berkeley, number 32. Very abstract. Diebenkorn, interior with a book. This to me kind of reminds me a little bit of like an Edward Hopper, except the brushwork isn't nearly as smooth. And then we also have this woman in a room here, which is also a Diebenkorn. Ocean Park. It's in Santa Monica in an artistic area. This was not a particularly good area when he was painting. Diebenkorn's studio set on a hillside. He looked out and up at the geometry of the hill and how the streets crossed each other. And this was what he painted. This was 1969 Ocean Park, number 24. It's about how the streets are crossing. And Ocean Park, number 116, again, much more abstracted, much more simplified forms. This is also Diebenkorn. If you look closely, it's a skull. So Skull, 1992 watercolor. His late work is a vanitas, a memento mori, all is vanity, a symbol of death. And so skulls are a common motif in art. He was having health problems at this time, and I think mortality must have been on his mind. Certainly haunting, isn't it? This is a late work by Diebenkorn. Jean-Michel Basquiat. This photograph was actually taken by Andy Warhol, 1982. And in this particular work is by Jean-Michel Basquiat, and it's untitled, 1982. A number of his works were untitled. His works were very gestural, very bold. They were based in New York graffiti art. That's where he got his start, was New York graffiti art. And he went to museums when he was a kid. His mother took him to museums frequently. And so he loved these real bold images. Crowns often show up in a lot of Basquiat's work. So this is just tip of the iceberg. I just finished a Basquiat lecture, but that's much more involved. And there is an incredible Basquiat lecture until, I think it's October 5th, maybe it's the 10th. But anyway, October 5th, 2023. In Los Angeles, and it's called Basquiat, King's Pleasure. And there's a number of works that have been submitted by his sisters, and a lot of these works have never even been seen. It's a fantastic exhibition, and I saw it over the summer, and I recommend it highly. It's a little pricey. I want to say it was $22 or $29. I think they do give a student discount, but if you do go to the Broad, go across the street and go to King's Pleasure. And this is, again, it takes you a little while to go through, at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half. It's 4 rooms that kind of meander through this area, but they did extend it into October. And so, again, here we can see the scale of it. He liked to work big. And then Warhol did these Polaroids. That's what they did. In fact, Cal State Fullerton owns a few Warhol Polaroids, and because I've seen them on exhibit periodically, and they're pretty cool. Andy Warhol, portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat, 1982, a metallic pigment in acrylic medium and silkscreen on canvas. Silkscreen was something Warhol and his factory did a great deal. And so this is Andy Warhol, portrait of Jean-Michel Basquiat. Unfortunately, he died at 27 of a heroin overdose. It was very, very sad. In fact, going through the exhibition, I was surprised how very, very sad I was. You really see the loss of this incredible artist who was really cut short. His time here was cut so short. So thank you, and that's a timeline. It kind of brings you through most of